why might national debt have increased in the UK? Now, before you, or whilst you think about this, I'm going to go over the basic sort of mathsy side of it, but I want you guys to think about the AO2 here. What has happened in the UK recently or in the last 10, 20 years that might have caused national debt to increase? In terms of the mathsy side of what's happened, it must be because we've had, so national debt has increased because we've had consecutive fiscal deficits. Must be the case. Now, if the national debt increases at an increasing rate, again, this goes back to this sort of marginal total thing, this would be because the fiscal deficit is getting larger, but we'll not worry about that yet. Consecutive fiscal deficits implies you have relatively high G and relatively low T. So this is what must have happened in the UK if you write down the maths. If we have a national debt, which is, again, it's a mathematical concept, it's like a total and accumulation of your deficits. This must be because we've had consecutive deficits, which of course is when G is greater than T. So that implies, again, your country has a bit of a problem with government spending and tax, i.e. it is spending too much and tax revenue is not enough. Question to you guys is why in the UK? Why might this have happened? So answer from Mira, answer from Devak. So Mira, great one, and she's put it in all capital letters as well, which I thought was a lovely touch because this is a really important one. 2008 financial crisis. See, I said it in capitals as well, right, to stress how important it is. 2008 financial crisis, arguably massive. And this is actually one of the more complex ones. So I think I'm going to hit a pin on that and come back to that later, or I'm going to go on a massive tangent and then we'll lose focus. But great suggestion from Mira. 2008 financial crisis, very, very important here. Any other suggestions? I'll come to Devax next. So remind me to talk about this one again if I forget. Devak has said unemployment rising, benefits increasing, and tax revenue decreasing. So what Devak has said makes sense in theory. So very, very carefully, if unemployment has been rising, if there's been more unemployment, the government has to spend more on unemployment benefits, which would explain this. And it's going to receive less from income tax because there's less people working, which would explain this, right? So Devak's answer makes sense in theory. But does anyone know the problem if you apply that theory to the UK over the past, let's say, 10, 12, 15 years? So again, great answer in theory. But if you guys have been doing some basic AO2 research on unemployment, inflation, growth in the UK, you would have hopefully some sort of answer here. Anybody, let me make this simpler. Anybody tell me what unemployment has been like over the past decade or so in the UK? Has it been low, high, near to full employment, lots of unemployment, right? What are we talking? Yeah, you said, does it depend on the type of unemployment? Well, yeah, almost certainly yes. Yes, frictional unemployment, for example, much less likely for people to claim benefits, and therefore it's not going to be as relevant. So again, in theory, that's correct, but I don't think that's the point I'm making about the UK. I don't know whether there's been more frictional unemployment in the UK, for example. Harsh, well done, Harsh, very good. Unemployment in the UK has generally stayed quite low in the UK over the past, since maybe 2010-ish, 2011, I want to say. Really strangely low. It's actually one of the very, very strange things about the Western capitalist economies at the moment. So places like America, Germany may be facing similar issues in the medium term, which is that growth and employment have become decoupled. So they used to be coupled, And what that means is economists thought that if growth goes up, employment goes up, and vice versa. What is really weird about what's happening in the modern era is that employment has been really, really high quite consistently. Like the Conservatives, if it's, as you may know, have been in power since 2010, so 13 years. One of the big things they always talk about that we've done well is we've kept unemployment really low, 13 years, and unemployment's been almost record lows, near full employment. So again, for the UK, employment not really an issue we've had in the past 10 years. So Devak's point makes sense in theory, but again, in practice, it doesn't apply well to the UK. He's given another suggestion though. So tax brackets increasing. The again, in theory, this could so tax brackets increasing would mean less revenue being earned. Yes, although this is a more complicated one than I was hoping for. But okay, let me give you guys some basics, and we'll return to 2008 financial crisis later. So very easy one, very important one to talk about for the UK is aging population. Make sure you write that one down. Easy to find lots of stats about that. I don't have any to hand, but definitely more old people around, less young people. Well-known fact about the UK population demographics. And this means very simply more old people, more government spending required. It's not even a case of Conservative versus Labour here. It doesn't matter who's in government here. If you have NHS, if you have free healthcare, the more old people you have in your country, the more public spending on healthcare is required. And the flip, it's not a flip side, the other side of the coin, which is also bad, is that if you have more old people as a percentage of the population, you have less young people, less working people paying tax, right? So it's as simple as saying, let's say 60% of your population is young, 40% is old. You've got 60 in every 100 are paying tax, 40 in every 100 are needing spending, right? If over time you have an aging population and now 50% of the country is old, 50% of the country is working, you've now got 10 less people in every 100 working and 10 more people in every 100 who need government spending on healthcare. State pensions as well is another big part of that, but healthcare is the easiest one to talk about, I think. So the aging population, demographics in the UK, and again many other Western economies, is a very big problem and a very significant cause of debt. I'd love to go off on a political rant at the moment, but I'm going to try not to, a big tangent, because so much of the next election in terms of Labour versus Conservatives is about this fiscal management, debt management. Labour normally want to spend a lot, but they can't because of the UK's debt challenge. It's very difficult as well to fix if the problem is aging population, right? Because there are really humane ways to solve that problem. Anyway, again, whole big other tangent. Ishana said UK energy price caps. So recently, yes, this is very short term though, and I want to talk more about medium term issues again, like last decade or so. So the other thing I would talk about that is quite important is the as well as the financial crisis, COVID. And if I was doing a 50 marker on this, I would put this all under external shocks like COVID, like the financial crisis mean you have a very big increase in government spending. Think the furlough scheme, for example. And because the shock of COVID or financial crisis creates a lot of short-term unemployment, you often for a year or two you have much lower taxes. So this is typically what happens, it seems, with the financial crisis and COVID. The external shock, the crisis hits the economy. That creates a very problematic year or two where government spending has to rise to support people in the crisis. Tax revenues fall because people aren't working, businesses aren't profitable, again because of the crisis. And then that sort of pushes you into an unusually large deficit, and then that adds more to national debt. So that's definitely a problem. And there's a lot more to say about the financial crisis specifically, but I'll do that at the end. What else is part of my easier points? You could, I'll give a kind of like left wing and right wing view here. Because I don't want to come across as biased, even though I am biased. I don't want to come across as biased. So I'll give like a left wing perspective and a right wing perspective. So a left winger, you know, those filthy communists, socialists, they might argue something like tax avoidance and evasion. I've probably, hopefully, gone on a rant about Nadeem Zahawi before. If I haven't, just have a look at the name with the word tax in Google. Nadeem Zahawi tax scandal. Type that in, and it's increasingly evident that very wealthy, rich people can use very clever accounting and tax loopholes to actually pay very, very relatively small amounts of tax. So Nadeem Zahawi, very, very rich person, earning literally tens of millions of pounds a year, paid an effective tax rate of 10%. So that is way, way less than like teachers, nurses, cleaners, like every poor person is paying. And that's only because the form of wealth he has and the difficulty of taxing it, or the ease with which money can be moved to offshore tax havens like Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. So this is something, again, I'd love to talk more about, but in the interest of being concise, the argument is it's become far less effective. The government has become far less effective at collecting tax from the very rich. It's very easy for very rich people to evade tax or avoid tax now in a way that wasn't possible maybe 30, 40 years ago. That is related to globalization and global financial markets. If you think that it's now much easier for a very rich person to move money from one country to another, it's therefore logically much easier for them to avoid paying the same share of tax as, say, a teacher pays, which, again, from a left-wing perspective, is seen as a key problem. But I think maybe more right-wing leaning people might say this is not such a huge issue. And they might say, well, that's not the real problem. The real problem is inefficient public services. So schools, hospitals spending too much money, having very low productivity because there's high state control. Again, this might be my bias creeping in, but I'm not sure how well this applies to the UK, where in, say, the NHS, there's been sort of increasing semi-privatization rather than decreasing. But this is an argument that you can make that there's been large increase in government spending because government spending has become more inefficient, and that could be, again, lack of a profit motive, job security, too much job security for civil servants, or things like this. So anyway, because I don't want to spend too long on this, let's go to my next one, which was 2008 financial crisis. Let's talk about this. So, 2008 financial crisis. Why is this potentially so important? I would say this and the aging population are the two maybe most important, or at least most interesting. And they would be two I would focus on if I was doing a question on this. But I think the financial crisis has contributed perhaps very significantly to UK debt because of the way it has affected the economic cycle. So typically, of course, in the long run, the trend is for economy to grow over time, get richer. but the actual pattern of this growth is quite variable. Go up and down and up and down. Okay. So the idea with national debt really is basically that, think about it this way: in your boom, in your positive output gap period, you are likely to not need to spend much because everyone's employed, everyone's doing well, it's great, and you're gonna make a lot of tax. So you in theory, you're more likely to have a surplus here. And likewise, in a recession, a crash, you have a deficit, but then you go back to a surplus. So basically, good times, government's going to be making money, not need to spend much money, you have a surplus. Bad times, government needs to spend a lot of money, not going to be making much money, you have a deficit. So what should happen? Put your thinking caps on. What should happen to national debt over time? If you have a fiscal surplus, then a deficit, then a surplus, then a deficit, what should happen to national debt? And Debian has asked me if I am a left winger. Leaning. I'm a swing voter really, for what that's worth. But anyway, okay, Ishan, well done. Yes, national debt stable. It should be. You shouldn't have big debt problems if this is true, right? You go from a surplus, then you deficit. Oh no, you have to borrow money to cover the deficit, but then you go into surplus and then you make the money to pay off your debt. So again, in theory, like if the economic cycle, at least over the long term, sort of holds, and I think trend growth is consistently upwards because the growth helps you pay off debt in the long term, then again, it shouldn't necessarily be a problem. But what was very interesting about the financial crisis, and in the main AQA textbook, they have a beautiful actual graph, like the actual data. I'm just going to show you like a rough idea of what happened. So you've maybe got like 1990s .com bubble burst, and that's got a bit of a crisis, and then you've got leading up to 2008. Economy recovers, goes through this massive boom. Everyone's really rich. Very, very funny, really. Before 2008, economists had come up with a lot of theories that financial markets were finally fully efficient and there would never be financial crises again. There's actually a very famous interview. The head of the Bank of America, basically their equivalent of the Bank of England, said that financial markets were the most stable they'd ever been. And then like a few months later, boom, financial crisis. But anyway, story for another time. 2008, we got the financial crisis, and whoa, okay, so and big drop. Is looking really bad. What should we expect to happen afterwards? Of course, we go back, and that did happen. What's kind of very strange is that there was never really a, how do I put it? There was never really a return to previous heights. Normally, like one boom, you go down, the next boom is even better, and then the next boom is even better. The way you can think it is, it's like the financial crisis kind of slowed down the whole economy and kind of shifted the curve to what it was, over here. And like these years almost got cancelled, and we rewind. And what that has the very interesting effect of doing is that our trend kind of actually went like that. And it's got pulled down because the actual growth the actual GDP never really got quite back to where it was. Now, since then, what has effectively happened is the economy's almost flatlined, at least in real terms, with very, very, very little growth per year. And it is kind of then gonna lead to a more and more flatlining trend as well. Kind of like in the movies when you got someone on the heart monitor and up and down, and then if their heart stops beating or something, you flatline. That's kind of what's been happening to the UK economy. And does anyone, because again, I couldn't help it, I have gone on a bit of a wild tangent here. Can anyone bring us back to fiscal deficits, national debt? Why is this such a problem? This weird kind of disturbance of the typical economic cycle. Like the financial crisis is really just it's blowing the whole shape, out of whack. Why is that such a big deal for our debt situation? Now I've made this very complicated, but you can make the answer here very simple. And I wouldn't draw this in the exam, just for why is it such a problem if the trend has been lowered and if the actual is not fluctuating far above the trend anymore? So mirrors is like a very nice answer. Brilliant. Yes. As basically your economy begins to plateau, you don't have big surpluses anymore. This is exactly what's happening in the UK. Even in our good times, the good times aren't that good. So we had a really, really, really colossally bad time. And then instead of having like a really big boom after that to pay for the crisis, we just kind of flatlined. So we never really started generating the money back to pay for the big debt that the financial crisis created. And then what happened in 2020? Boom, another crisis. And it's this compounding effect of having these big shocks without a big boom that follows. And again, this is very interesting in terms of whether this is really down to the financial crisis or something that would have happened anyway, maybe, I don't know, but fascinating in terms of how this might have sort of just completely changed the situation for the UK economy and for the fiscal deficit. But Mira's just given such a nicely worded explanation. I'm going to read it out loud in case anyone wants to copy this down or reword it. So she said, as growth begins to plateau, you don't have a major surplus and cannot pay off the profound debt. And that's basically what's happening. You've got this huge, profoundly large deficit that's been created by a crisis. And then if your economy plateaus as a result of the crisis, it stops kind of having a big upwards momentum, you can't pay off the debt that occurs from the crisis. So that's the UK. Lovely, huh? That you feel very happy that you live here now. But to be honest, most countries, at least with UK living standards, are in a very similar situation. So very much a tongue-in-cheek